Welcome back to the Garage, Episode 2, Season 1. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Just wanted to give a huge shout out to everyone who tuned in for our first episode. We both very much so appreciate it. I'm Josiah.
And I'm James.
And this is the Garage. So, for this episode, we decided to kind of dive into Black Lives Matter. More so just kind of the injustices we face in America today when it comes to racism, kind of just going over the facts, right? Because I think there's a huge miscommunication when it comes to this specific subject that is causing a lot more division rather than the coming together as a nation. And I've also had this as requested. People have requested this already. And so I think it's important to address it. James?
Absolutely. I think it's important to know the history a little bit about how the African community got to where it is today. Because by addressing the history, we can further understand how they got to where they are today and what we can do to change it.
Well said. Full disclaimer, prior to us moving forward, we are specifically going to be addressing facts or what we best recollect on these facts. We're going to leave links in the description to a lot of what we've done in research. That way you guys can fact check us and you guys can maybe do some of your own research and hopefully they do you well. And yeah. So we're going to be going over 4 major issues when it comes to racism, and those are going to be wealth, education, incarceration, and representation. Where would you like to start? Which one would you like to start with?
Let's start with wealth and how history itself has affected the past and carried on through generations and affected the present day today.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty fair. So, if we're looking at present day, right, we have to understand why, like jobs, right, in these communities are so scarce. Statistically, the unemployment for an African American man is 2 times higher than that of a Caucasian or white man in America. And we have to look at why, we have to address why that is and how we got to that statistic, right? So, kind of going back, and you're going to hear us bring this up a lot when it comes to this word called redlining, which is essentially systematic racism that says, okay, we're not going to approve a specific person based on ethnicities or race. And James, go ahead, correct me if I'm wrong on redlining.
Well, Josiah, I'm going to read you the effects of redlining. So according to ChicagoFed.org, it says, we study the effects of 1930s redlining maps on the long-run trajectories of neighborhoods. Using a boundary design and propensity score methods, we find that the maps led to reduced home ownership rates, house values, and rents, and increased racial segregation in later decades. We also compare cities on either side of the population cutoff that determine whether maps were drawn and find broadly similar results. We conclude that the HOLC maps had meaningful and lasting effects on the development of urban neighborhoods through reduced credit access and subsequent disinvestment. So essentially what that's saying is homes that were considered redlined or in the red line district have less value on their homes, and as a result, they essentially affect the income, right? And affect the value of the homes, which plays a major role in how communities can progress in their future in a way.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. So in what you said, but that was more so the definition, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So there was a study done out of Chicago in 2017 that displayed that redlining was still very prominent today, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that these communities were still being created, or I don't know if enforced is the correct term, but essentially that's what it was saying. That was the conclusion of the study, right? I think if, kind of even just talking about racism, that alone to me just shows so much what racism really is, right? Where we're creating these creating St. Louis created, Chicago was created, Compton was created, right? And they weren't created by African Americans, right? They were created by white people to essentially put them in an area where we can control that area. There's actually a quote I would like to read. This comes back from when Richard Nixon launched the war on drugs, and this came from his cabinet post-presidency. So the quote goes, "Why the war on drug users," right? And it says, and I quote, "You want to know what this was really about? Nixon had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing them both heavily, we disrupt those communities. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." John Eichelman, counsel and assistant to U.S. President Nixon.
So essentially what it's saying is it's using drugs and crime as an excuse to incarcerate, incriminate African Americans and get rid of them as much as possible.
Right.
Which it's essentially using the law for racism.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the whole systematic racism. And before we, dive too much, that could definitely border, and we can go back to that once we talk about the incarceration. However, there was a key word in there that pretty much says that redlining was already in place and already been, done. It said disrupt those communities. I mean, words are very important, no?
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
So these communities were already created. It was to disrupt the community, meaning these inner cities, meaning these urban cities that are predominantly African American. With that being said, kind of going back to the wealth aspect of it, these communities, while they're already lower in income, that means their tax is going to be lower. And I don't know if you knew this or know this or not, but these schools are funded by these tax dollars, right? Yeah. These teachers are paid from the tax dollar. So with it being so low in income, you can only imagine how bad these school systems are going to be.
Absolutely. It's
going to enable them to not have these extracurriculars, to have poor extracurriculars, if any, right?
Yep.
So essentially, when this entire thing started, it was to set them up for as much failure as possible going forward. And unfortunately, I don't think it's been addressed properly. before we even decided on this episode, I never knew what redlining was. I had no idea how. I had an idea kind of that these communities were essentially created by white people, but I had no idea it was still prominent today, and I had no idea that the wealth was making these communities even worse.
So let me ask you a question, Josiah. From a very simplistic point of view, why don't they just move?
I've heard that a lot. A lot of people are like, "Oh well, if your life is so bad, why don't you just relocate?" I would have to say definitely that one of the major things that kind of don't allow that to happen is one, you have to look at the generational culture, right? I mean, my entire family is from Kentucky, and the only people to ever move out of that area was my brother and myself. And I look at the area where I grew up in, and it was a very low income area as well. But just to pick up on your own and then move away, that alone is incredibly hard. It's a complete restart on everything. Now, unless your entire family picks up and moves, then I say the chances just for off that are relatively low. And then you have to also look at the whole redlining, right? They have very low income. These areas are very low income. In order for them to pick up and move, they have to have income. They have to have money put away. They have to have a whole lot of things that, because of systematic racism, they're not going to have.
Yeah.
And so for the people that are just like, oh, well, it's their own fault, you could technically say that, right?
Yeah.
However, I think making that comparison is extremely unfair, and kind of one of those things where you are just picking as much as you can away from it to kind of prove your point.
Exactly. So one thing I want to throw out there is essentially they don't have money to move. And on top of that, they've become so accustomed to their communities that they might not even think about moving to another community, to another state. So let me ask some of the viewers this, how many of you have actually moved out of your state? How many of you have actually moved completely to another city, to another country even, right? I'd have to say the majority of the people have grown up and lived in your hometown or in your home state, right? And with that being said, that's just essentially what these African American families are doing. They're just staying in what they've grown up in, and they don't think about what's outside of their community. They don't think about what's on the other side. Yeah. Essentially, they don't see the possibilities of a better life because they're so accustomed to the life that they have, and they don't know that there is a better place out there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense, James. I think that was really well put. So definitely, man. Kudos to James, everybody. Spitting the knowledge. Okay. Let's move on to the education. And this is going to be a very brief one, just because the whole wealth, and we've already kind of hit on it a little bit, but just to specify and kind of just tap on it, the wealth plays a giant factor when it comes to how much education is available to these communities. Just to let you guys know, we're definitely going to be addressing kind of both sides of the spectrum. We just wanted to address this side first. So stay tuned. We're going to be, a little bit later, maybe in another episode even, just depending on how long this one runs for. We'll definitely still be addressing cases in which racism doesn't really play a major factor when it comes to these police brutality cases. And hear me out, because when we go through it, I think just like we're addressing facts now, we're going to be addressing actual facts there as well. And then I'll state my personal opinion more towards the end. Just that way you guys understand like which side I stand for. And I think that's important. Dialing it back though, the whole wealth plays a major factor when it comes to the education, right? When it comes to teacher salaries, when it comes to these extracurriculars.
To equipment even.
To equipment, literally to everything. It's funded by the tax dollar. And kind of just moving through this one relatively brief because they're so close and they're so close and closely tied together that it doesn't, that you can't have one without the other almost, right? But essentially it just makes it, a lot harder when these education systems are not properly funded. And I would say when it comes to this education portion, I would say it's almost all because of the wealth aspect of it. When it comes to teacher salaries, right? So these teachers, they go to college, they get certified to actually teach. And then, I don't know about you, James, but if I'm a teacher and I just got out of college, I'm going to chase the money, right? Now, that's just me personally. I'm not saying there's no good teachers out there that are like, you know what? I want to devote
myself.
Yeah, I want to devote myself to one of these inner cities and actually try and go and make a difference. I'm not saying they do not exist. Do not get me wrong. But as a person who, has a family, I'm going to try to provide for that family as much as possible. It is just one of those hard decisions that you would have to make. And me personally, I would have to, at least try to meet somewhere in the middle of that. So you have these teachers that are getting right out of college or had already been in college and already been certified, and they're getting paid very low income to go teach at these inner cities already. And I think, that just plays a major role, And on top of that, they're not going to have the money to hire tutors. Tutors are very scarce in inner cities, based off what I remember on these statistics. James?
Yeah, I just want to throw out there that I went to a fairly decent public school, but not all the teachers could pay attention to every single student, right? And the classrooms were anywhere between 20 to 30 students, probably about normal size, right? Now, with some of these underfunded schools, the classrooms are overcrowded. The equipment is not on par with higher-end public schools. And the teachers are just overworked. They don't have enough attention to put forth the effort into every single student. And without the attention put into these students, they don't have any incentive to care. If they're already doing bad, the teacher's not going to go up to them and say, hey, let me help you with this, because there's just too many students. There's a lack of help for these students. And if students see that their teachers don't care, then why should they care? They might even have problems at home where essentially they have no reason to care because they're so worried about how they're going to take care of their families. Or, you know what? There's no point in me learning this stuff because I'm not going to strive in life anyways.
I definitely agree. I think the culture definitely plays a huge factor, a huge role in, how serious these kids are taking their education. And then you have to think in these inner cities where crime is astronomically high, right? Let's take Chicago, which is the number one city for crime right now in the United States. Now, you can't argue, there's no argument when it comes to acknowledging that crime in these inner cities are very, very prominent.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you have to understand what, when I say that the culture in these inner cities, they bring that stuff to school, right? Now, these teachers, they see that, right? And you have to understand that they're their job becomes more, I would say significantly more difficult when that culture is being brought into the school system. These overflooded classrooms, and not saying that every one of those classrooms are going to be influenced by the culture in these inner cities. However, you have to acknowledge that some, if not most, are.
Mm-hmm.
Which would make it increasingly more difficult for these teachers to actually do their job, which they're already underpaid for anyway. Right?
Yeah.
So, just with that being said, that's why we wanted to briefly touch on the education aspect of things. James, is there anything else you want to add on the education side?
Yeah. I just want to throw out there that teachers and students themselves, they may have personal problems going on at home given their environment. Let me put it like this. Imagine you guys having some kind of issue going on at home, right? Or you guys have some personal problems, or it's just your environment, right? How many times has it affected you guys going to work? How many times has it affected you guys going to school? Do you guys think your work or your school was important? Probably not. For the majority of us, you're probably distracted and these things are on the back of your mind. You can't focus on school. It's the least of your concerns. If you're in one of these less fortunate communities, you're probably worried about your family members, the lack of income, or even crime that's happening around your area, your safety even, right?
Yeah. Wow, James. Just wanted to say that's a very, very well-spoken way of putting things. I think by giving them something to think about will definitely open the eyes, hopefully, of some of our viewers, and hopefully, they share that, because what you just said is extremely accurate, But just wanted to say, very well-spoken, man. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to representation. We're going to save the incarceration for the very end, because there's a lot to be said on the incarceration. And I think that one's going to take the longest. So let's go ahead and move on to representation. So let's say one of these, a good example of this would say, let's say a child from one of these inner cities does make extremely good grades, right?
Yeah.
And you have a Caucasian kid who is growing up in a more privileged, right, community, and they get accepted to go to the same school to study the same thing, right? So where a white kid from a more privileged community, and you have a African American from a not privileged community, let's say they both do really good in school, right? And they both, again, against all odds. You got to remember, we're already talking about against all odds, right? Where the African American kid, right, is already struggling within his inner city, right? He's surrounded by the environment, and against all odds, he already was like, no, I want better than this in terms of my education. I'm going to take it seriously. I'm not going to get involved, even if that means I have to not adhere to the culture and society.
Absolutely.
So he's already beat the odds, yes. Right? Now here's where representation is extremely important to address, because let's say both of those kids go to the same college, have the exact same credentials, both graduate, same GPA. Now they're both out of college and they both apply for the same job, right? Who's more likely to get the job?
According to statistics, the person that has the more white-sounding name will get the job.
Exactly.
And I just want to throw this reference out there for some of you listeners. All right. So according to hbs.edu, minority job applicants are whitening their resumes by deleting references to their race with the hope of boosting their shot at jobs. And research shows the strategy is paying off. In fact, companies are more than twice as likely to call minority applicants for interviews if they submit whitened resumes than candidates who reveal their actual race. And this discriminatory practice is just as strong for businesses that claim to value diversity as those that don't. So for example, say Steve Smith, right? That sounds
Pretty white.
pretty white.
Yeah, go ahead, just say it. Yeah.
So if the applicant's first name is, say, Shaquan,
DeMarcus.
Tyrone, Latasha, right? All these names have an increased chance of not being called back.
2 times.
2 times even, right? Whereas if black last names, right, such as Smith, Johnson, or even Brown, those names have no impact of getting callbacks if they have a white sounding first name to go along with it.
Yeah, and I mean, I just wonder why that is, to be completely honest. Like, I don't, maybe, I mean, it definitely goes into the representation. I just think, again, this is just going back to the entire thing, man, where it's like, to say that racism does not exist, right, is absolutely ludicrous. It's crazy. Yeah. You cannot, there's no denying it. There's just none.
There has to be some kind of bias that goes along with it too, right? I think the term that we learned was implicit bias. It's biases that we don't necessarily know that we have, but we have them, right? If we can be more cognate of our implicit biases, we could further eradicate some of this racism in our community.
Yeah, man. I think kind of diving into that is, first, what needs to happen is the acknowledgement, right? I think that too many people across the board, they get offended, they get upset, because first off, let me address that I do not believe in reverse racism.
Mm-hmm.
I believe in racism on both sides of the spectrum. You know what I mean? I definitely, there's 100% no doubt in my mind, I've seen it, where racism exists on the African American side towards whites and whites towards blacks and any other ethnicity. We're not going to address that now because that's not the point of the episode. But I think that acknowledgement and the acknowledgement of what exists and why it exists is going to be the first major step. And I think, I hope by us educating or attempting to educate, that you guys can see, understand, and learn for yourselves, where there is actual racism. Anyway, without getting too far into that rabbit hole, because I'm very passionate about this subject, right? I think, I just think it's crazy how our country's being, not run, but how shaped. Yeah, absolutely, man. Definitely, it's once you understand what's really happening, it becomes almost sickening to see that in 2020 we're still facing the same, or not the same issues, and that goes into another topic, Jim Crow, which we're going to hit on directly after we talk about the incarceration. But there's not, when it comes to racism, people more so on the right side of things, on the quote unquote all lives matter side of things, would say that no, racism doesn't exist. It's been abolished. There's equal opportunity everywhere, and that's crazy.
So you said the majority, or some people on the right side, right, said that racism is abolished and there's equal opportunity everywhere.
Yeah.
Now, what's really interesting to me is even though the opportunity is out there, the people who present these opportunities, or the companies or whoever it is, right? There's still that implicit bias. They are less likely to provide these opportunities to African Americans or even minorities in this case, whether they realize it or not. And it's because of the past histories or the stereotypes or biases that have been placed on these minorities that play a huge factor, even though the companies or the persons or the individuals supposedly giving these opportunities to the minorities, right? Let
me cut you off real quick. I don't mean to cut you off. I definitely want to address something I just said, just so the audience does not think that I'm just making up some mythical numbers here, right? I said that people on the right more so believe that there's equal opportunity. There, you know what I'm saying? Racism has been abolished. And I have the statistic right here in front of me, just so I can read it, just so people are not like, okay, yeah, he's just blabbering about stuff he doesn't know about. Right from the PW Research Center, they took a survey on Republicans, Democrats, and Independents that either agreed or strongly supported, somewhat supported, opposed somewhat, or opposed strongly on Black Lives Matter. Right? Now, the Republicans said that 4 strongly supported, 16 somewhat supported, 17 opposed somewhat, and 35 opposed strongly. On the Democrat side, 29 strongly supported, 35 support somewhat, 5 oppose somewhat, 3 oppose strongly. And on the independent side, 11 strongly support, 31 support somewhat, 12 oppose somewhat, and 13 strongly oppose. So I think that statistic right there kind of verifies what I was saying earlier, and I just wanted to elaborate and get that statistic out there because that's one of those ones that I think people would hear and you'd be like, oh no, like that's not me. That's not what the right believes. Well, I mean, like statistically, guy, like that's exactly what the majority of the right believes.
And that's not to say that if you are more Republican or more Democratic or even independent, it doesn't mean that you're 100% going to believe everything that Josiah just stated, right? And vice versa. It's you are your own person. You believe in what you believe in. You can support whoever you support. Just because you belong to one party or another or no parties doesn't mean you don't have your own opinion or your own say in the subject of the matter.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, by no way am I trying to label or categorize anybody from the right or the left. I just simply wanted to state facts and statistics that have been done, studies that have already been done. But yeah, James, do you have anything else for us on the representation aspect of things?
Yeah, I just want to hit up the fact that even though people claim not to be racist or stereotypical, yeah, maybe you're not racist, but the stereotypes are somewhat still relevant, and they come off as, again, implicit biases, because they're biases that you may not realize that you have, but they're somehow in the back of your mind. So for people who are hiring minorities, you may have some kind of bias that is already there, whether you realize it or not, that affects how you view these individuals. It may lead to less opportunities for these minorities, and as a result, further increase their chances of not getting a job, which also carries over and affects their environment, their wealth, their families, which will play a big role, especially if you're trying to get your family, get yourself out of this situation, right?
Yeah, man, I agree with everything you're saying, but we have to kind of move on just because we're running short on time. This episode is running relatively long. With that being said, next week on our next episode, we're going to be addressing kind of the other side of the spectrum, right? That goes into a whole nother spiel of ideals and kind of the media's narrative and them trying to push that to believe racism isn't what it really is, and why people have a poor, kind of funny representation of what racism truly looks like. And you're definitely not going to want to miss that episode. But moving on, we're going to go ahead and dive into the incarceration aspect of this systematic racism.
What was the name of the guy that was associated with the Nixon administration that said that they were using drugs and crime to arrest African Americans?
Well, specifically what I said was they were associating and affiliating one specific drug and placing it in one community in order to incarcerate blacks. Right. That was the quote. And who you're talking about is John Ish. How do you pronounce it? Ishrich-Lishman? I don't know how to pronounce the name. Okay. But yeah. So that's a really good starting point when it comes to definitely the incarceration. Definitely didn't start there, right? It started with Jim Crow. And let me go ahead and pull this up. So in 1868, ratification of the 14th Amendment technically, quote unquote, granted equal protections by law of constitutional rights to African Americans, essentially meant to abolish black codes. Shortly after the abolishment of black codes, Jim Crow laws and state and local statuses that legalized racial segregation were enacted. Jim Crow laws looked to vanquish all protected rights of African Americans. By the 1900s, local municipalities began to construct police departments to enforce local laws in areas of the East Coast and Midwest, including Jim Crow laws. Local municipalities leaned on police to enforce and exert excessive brutality on African Americans who violated any Jim Crow law. Jim Crow law continued through the end of the 1960s. My mom was born in 1968, I think. Don't kill me, Mom, if I have that wrong. But yeah, I think it's absolutely crazy, man. Like the late 1960s, and this is what really boils my blood when people say that. One of the biggest things I hear from not necessarily the right, but essentially, right, people that disagree with the whole Black Lives Matter thing, and they're like, all lives matter, they say, oh yeah, well, slavery happened hundreds of years ago. I'm just like, 1960s, man. Like, that's less than a lifetime ago. Like, oh my gosh, so blows me away, man.
There may be no more slavery in America today, right? Mm-hmm. But there was still lots of racism back then.
Oh yeah, and it was so almost secretly emplaced, right? To where you can't directly say, "Oh yeah, there's no racism," because you can't say that because legally it looks like there isn't.
Yeah.
Right, but it just blows my mind just of how recent that is.
What really blows my mind is the fact that they said that they considered African Americans equals, but they had them segregated from the whites, you know?
Yeah.
And even when the African Americans were presented the opportunity to vote, there were obstacles put in the way that prevented them from vote, such as, voting fees?
Yeah, oh man, jeez. Are you kidding me? And then the grandfather clause?
Yeah, the literacy test.
Oh, dude.
They essentially deterred African Americans from voting because they didn't want to pay the fees, or there were literacy tests put in place that, not all African Americans back then could read or write. Majority. And they had grandfather clauses for low-income Caucasian men that said if your ancestors, your parents, or your great-grandfather, whoever, right, have voted in the past, you were allowed to vote, bypassing the literacy test, bypassing the fees.
Yep. You didn't have to pay the fee or pass the literacy test if the grandfather clause was enacted, which the grandfather clause, again, what you were saying is that if an ancestor, whether it be your dad or grandfather or great-grandfather or uncle, whoever, anyone in your heritage has previously voted, you are immediately allowed to vote, regardless of literacy test or voting fee. So yeah, essentially that's what Jim Crow law was, right? Which was a way for us to systematically put laws in place to segregate blacks further up until the late early 1960s, right? Moving away from that though, let's kind of move into the statistics when it comes to incarceration of African Americans. One of the biggest ones is the United States has 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's largest prison population. So that's one that's going to play into a few of these next statistics that really need to be looked at and taken seriously. So again, we're gonna list all of our resources in the description of this episode. That way you guys can fact check us. Okay, so with that being said, 1 in 17 white males will go to jail, prison in their lifetime, while for black males, the odds are 1 in 3. Now, I really want to make you... That statistic could be looked at in two different ways, considering the population of white males, or white people in general, 76% of the U.S. population, while only about 12% are African Americans. However, I still think that the statistic is kind of crazy to me, right? And I think that also kind of all of these facts that we've hit on tonight they all play into each other in some facet or another, right? Because that number is probably so low just because of the environment and culture, of, you know what I mean? The culture of it all, right? Let's move into another one. The exception clause in the 13th was there to rebuild South's economy through prison slave labor. After the Civil War, African Americans were arrested in massive groups, often for minor crimes, in order to fill the hole in the South's economy after slavery was abolished. This is the verified reason this clause was included. And I could go on and on and on and on and on with these statistics, right? And that's why we're going to list it below. More or less, the incarceration rate for African Americans is significantly higher, right? I think the statistic, from what I recollect, the statistic looks something like a African American is 2 times more likely to get a longer sentence than a white man on the same charges. Ludicrous. Absolutely insane to me. Right? What do you think about these statistics, man?
I definitely do think that it's a little bit high themselves, right? Especially if African Americans were getting arrested and put in prison for dumb things like loitering and vagrancy. For those of you who don't know what vagrancy is, it's essentially a person who walks around that has no permanent home or employment. So essentially it's a homeless person. You're getting arrested for being homeless. I didn't know homelessness was a crime, but apparently back then African Americans were getting arrested for being homeless, which is pretty insane, honestly.
Yeah. So essentially, guys, what we're saying, the entire reason we wanted to address this is because, in my personal opinion, and James is going to list his personal opinion, that these are real things in today's day and age, in 2020 today, that not only are not being addressed, but are being looked over. I think the media is pushing their agenda, their narrative, to believe that they're trying, in my honest opinion, I think they're trying to distract us, right? They're causing more division. And they're not even on facts. Like in next week's episode, we're going to go over some of these facts to show you how absolutely corrupt the media is, how corrupt and I'm going to be very careful when I say this, the government is, right? Because the government does not care, right, really about the issues. They want to push their narrative so they can get elected. Yeah. And no one is addressing these facts. Like we had to dig research. We had to dig for research on this stuff because it's not common knowledge.
Absolutely.
So, with that being said, I hopefully you guys took something or a lot away from this, and these episodes are kind of long because there's just a lot of information. But with the election being 39 days out or 38 days out, I think it's very important to understand exactly what's happening in today's society and culture as a whole. You know, we need somebody to address this for what it is. And, you know, next week's episode, again, we're going to go over the media and how the media is pushing their own narrative and not addressing these facts and not addressing, you know, some of these major issues that really need to be addressed. James?
All right, so here are my thoughts on it. Even though the majority of racism is gone today, it doesn't mean the negative effects are gone as well. Because whatever happened in the history has carried it into the present. And they still exist today. And if we don't do something about it, it's going to continue to carry on and affect future generations to come. Now, I don't necessarily know how we're going to address this issue or what we're going to do about it, but I do acknowledge that it is out there and we should do something about it. Now, I know that some of you guys don't necessarily know much about the African American history, but it goes to show that if you don't know much about the past, then the majority of people out there don't know it as well. And you can't fix what you don't know. So it's good to go out there, learn about this stuff, and then maybe start to formulate a plan on your own. But it's food for thought. That's all I got to say.
If you guys liked the episode, please, you know, make sure you hit that download button. Make sure you hit that follow button. You can find all of our social medias on our website. And if you liked it, please share it. We keep our content free. And in order to keep it free and it stay free, we need downloads. So please share. Not only because we want to keep our content free, this is really good information. Okay.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to go ahead and plug in our social medias. Instagram is The Garage Mindset. You know, make sure you go follow that. Our Twitter is at Garage Mindset, and our Facebook is The Garage Mindset. You know, please go show your support, show your love, share it with your friends, your family, and whoever else you like or even hate. And also, we are going to be dropping merch soon. So if you guys want, you know, the best high quality t-shirts, hoodies, hats, it will be available soon, plastered with our awesome logo. It's fantastic. It'll be great. And you'll be the cool kid in school if you grab this hoodie. All right, guys.
Well, real quick, if you guys have any thoughts on what we should talk about next, give us a comment on our website.
Or DM, private message, whatever you want to call it, on any of our social platforms. Thank you guys for tuning in to The Garage, Episode 2, Season 1. Stick around for Episode 3 because you will not want to miss it. Thank you, and good night.
Peace.